Okay, in the example at the top of this slide, we're looking at the diffusion of an orange dye through a beaker of water across a permeable membrane, right? And we talked about how all of those orange dye molecules have a certain amount of thermal energy, which means they're vibrating. And as they're vibrating and bouncing around, some of them might pass across that permeable membrane and make their way to the other side. And this can go in either direction, left to right, right to left. So even though each of those orange dye molecules are moving completely randomly, right, the net diffusion direction for the population of orange molecules as a whole is going to be from the left-hand side of the beaker to the right, right? They're going to want to spread out. They're going to go down their concentration, so from an area where they're highly concentrated on the left-hand side to an area where they're not so concentrated on the right, right? So net diffusion direction will be from left to right until the system reaches equilibrium and you have equal concentrations of those orange dye molecules on either side. They don't stop moving once the system has reached equilibrium. They continue bouncing around, but again, for every one orange molecule that goes over to the left-hand side, you have another one going over to the right. Now, we can make this particular scenario far more complicated by adding a second dye, right? This would be like mixing sugar and salt together in water, right? And then seeing how they diffuse through the solution. In this case, though, we're going to use orange dye, we're going to use purple dye. So the orange dye setup at the bottom of the slide is exactly the same as above, right? We're going to take that orange dye, we're going to concentrate on the left-hand side of the beaker, and its net diffusion direction will be down its concentration gradient, and those orange dye molecules will spread out so that they eventually reach equilibrium. Now, at the same time, we've also added purple dye molecules, but these guys we've added to the right-hand side of the beaker, right? So the purple dye is more concentrated on the right-hand side than the left. So the net diffusion direction for those purple dye molecules is going to be from the right-hand side to the left, down their concentration gradient. So as you can see, solute molecules, as they diffuse through a solution, they are sort of elitist. They really only care about themselves. Purple dye molecules will move down the purple concentration gradient, and the orange dye molecules will only move down the orange dye concentration gradient. They don't care about what the other dye or what the other solute is doing. So technically, when we're looking at the diffusion of molecules or solutes within a solution, think of those solutes as being elitist. They only will move down their own concentration gradient, irregardless of what other substances are mixed within that particular solution. Okay, so to review, right, we've talked about diffusion of particles, molecules, let's say substances, right? Substances tend to diffuse down their concentration gradient. Now, just to make sure we're clear on what a concentration gradient is, it's defined as the region along which the density of a chemical substance either increases or decreases. So if a substance is moving down its concentration gradient, it's moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. In order to get substances to move down their concentration gradient, no work must be done. All right, so this is a very simple, natural process that doesn't need any extra energy put into it. So when we apply these concepts to the diffusion of substances across a biological membrane, we're talking about substances moving down their concentration gradient across this membrane, right? So from an area of high concentration on one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane where the concentration is low. And again, because substances are moving down their concentration gradient, no work needs to be done on the part of the cell to get those substances across the membrane. So we call this type of transport passive transport. Okay? So for passive transport, two criteria must be met. Number one, the substance is moving down its concentration gradient as it passes across the membrane. And number two, the cell does not need to exert any energy on its part to get those substances to move, right? That's passive transport. Okay, we're ready to move on to a similar topic, right? Here we're going to start talking about osmosis. Now, osmosis is actually diffusion, what we just talked about, but it's diffusion of a specific molecule. This is diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane. Now, water gets a little bit tricky when we talk about osmosis and which direction it moves across the membrane. So first of all, this particular slide will introduce osmosis, right? So it's the diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane. And the way that water moves, it's going to move from an area of low solute concentration to an area of high solute concentration. Kind of the opposite of what we just talked about in the section on diffusion. Right, so first of all, let's review. What is a solution? Right? Remember, a solution is going to be when you have substances mixed in some sort of liquid, right? So sugar water is a solution. Your water is your solvent, and your sugar is your solute. So if we're looking at, for example, the diffusion of water molecules within different sugar and water solutions, the water is going to move from an area of low solute or low sugar concentration to an area of high solute or sugar concentration. All right, so sometimes students like to remember it as the water chases high solute concentration. Wherever the solute concentration is high, that's the direction that water wants to go. It kind of wants to join the party, right? Doesn't want to get left behind. So let's take a look at a quick animation that sort of introduces this idea of osmosis.
The plasma membrane is permeable to water molecules, and the movement of water into and out of cells is critical to life. Diffusion of water molecules across a selectively permeable membrane is a special kind of passive transport called osmosis.
So on this slide, we have an example of a glass U-tube in the upper left-hand corner. And this glass U-tube has been filled with water. And right in the bottom, in between the two sides of the U-tube, we've placed a selectively permeable membrane. Now this membrane is permeable to water, so water can easily get across to either side of the U-tube. And so you'll notice that initially the level of the water on both sides of the U-tube is level. The other thing that we add to this U-tube are solutes, so sugar molecules in this case. And we're going to add more sugar molecules to the right-hand side of the U-tube than the left-hand side of the U-tube. Now, while water can move across the membrane at the bottom of the U-tube, the sugar molecules cannot. And so this U-tube, this system, would like to reach equilibrium. It would like to have equal concentration of sugar molecules on both sides of the U-tube. And if there was no membrane at the bottom, then all of these sugar molecules, again, would diffuse to the other side in the net diffusion direction until we have an equal distribution of those solute or sugar molecules throughout the entire U-tube. But again, the problem is that that membrane down here at the bottom is not permeable to sugar molecules. So all the sugar molecules on the right-hand side are stuck on the right-hand side, and all the sugar molecules on the left are stuck on the left-hand side. So in this case, the sugar does not move, and yet the system still wants to reach equilibrium. So the water says, okay guys, I'll be nice and I will help everybody out. I'm going to move from an area where the solute concentration is low on the left-hand side over to the right-hand side where solute concentration is high to try to dilute out that high sugar concentration so that we can reach equilibrium and actually have equal concentration of the solute molecules on both sides. And so once the system has reached equilibrium, you'll notice on the right-hand side here, you have very different levels of water on each side of the U-tube, but the concentration of those green sugar molecules on both sides is about equal now. So the system has actually reached equilibrium. So this is one way of looking at diffusion. So when you follow the water molecules are going to move from an area of low solute concentration here on the left to an area of high solute concentration over there on the right. Now, if that explanation of diffusion makes sense to you, stick with it. All right, you can even fast forward the video a little bit if you like. But if you want a different way of looking at osmosis that is a little more similar to the way that we understand diffusion, then check out this next example. So if we were to zoom in on this little portion here of the membrane, and we can see this blow up down here, right? So you see all the individual water molecules plus all the green sugar molecules. Now, technically, there are two different kinds of water molecules in the solution. There are those free water molecules that are moving around completely on their own, and then there also are bound water molecules that are actually helping to dissolve the sugar within that aqueous solution, right? And so these guys are forming that hydration shell around this green sucrose molecule, right? So free water versus bound water. If you take a look at the number of free water molecules, on which of the two sides of the membrane do you see more? Is it the left-hand side here or the right-hand side? Hopefully you're thinking, well, obviously there are more free water molecules on the left-hand side of the U-tube. Why? Well, there are fewer sugar molecules on this left-hand side for those water molecules to attach to. And so in this case, if you want to think of osmosis kind of like diffusion, and that molecules move down their concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, you can focus only on those free water molecules, right? So the free water molecules, their concentration is higher on the left-hand side because there's less sugar, and so the water will move down its free water concentration over to the right-hand side where there are more sugar molecules, right? And again, you have the exact same result, that water migrating from the left to the right-hand side to try to dilute out all of those sugar molecules on that right side.